Imagine walking out your front door right now, looking up at the sky and knowing that every single human being on this planet is exactly like you. Not just the same species for 2 million years. No Neanderthals, no Denisovans, no modern humans with their smartphones and satellites. Just one kind of human, wandering across continents that hadn't even finished shifting into the shapes we recognize today. That was the world for an almost incomprehensibly long stretch of time, and then somehow that species vanished. That's the mystery we're chasing today. Before we get into it, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. I genuinely check the comments. There's something that gets me every time I see someone in Jakarta at midnight sitting next to someone in Chicago at noon, all watching the same story about creatures who walked the earth before our kind even existed. Drop it down there. Now back to the mystery. Because here's what makes this story so unsettling. The species we're talking about wasn't fragile. It wasn't some specialized animal perfectly adapted to one small corner of the world that collapsed the moment conditions shifted. This was a species that figured out fire, crossed open ocean straits, colonized environments from tropical forest to near Arctic steppe, and survived not one but dozens of ice ages. Whatever eventually removed them from the planet, it wasn't weakness. Something ended them anyway. The species goes by several names depending on who you ask and which fossil you're looking at. Homo erectus is the umbrella term most scientists use, though there's genuine debate about whether what we call erectus was actually one species or a loose collection of related populations separated by geography and time. The naming is messy, and we should be honest about that. But for now, when we say Homo erectus, think of a long dynasty, not a single portrait. A lineage that stretched across 2 million years and 3 continents, constantly shifting but somehow continuous. To figure out what happened to them, scientists have had to pull from wildly different fields. Fossil hunters digging through volcanic ash in East Africa. Geneticists tracing ancient DNA through populations that came after. Climatologists reading ice cores pulled from glaciers to reconstruct worlds that no longer exist. And archaeologists interpreting stone tools left behind by hands that had no language to explain why they made them. None of these fields alone tells the full story. All of them together get us somewhere close. What emerges is a picture that's part triumph and part tragedy. A species so durable it seems almost unkillable, and then a convergence of pressures so specific and so relentless that even 2 million years of adaptability wasn't enough. Whether that ending was sudden or slow, whether it was climate or competition or something stranger, that's exactly what we're here to find out. Let's start at the beginning, with the species itself. So who exactly were they? The name Homo erectus literally means upright human, which is a little ironic because by the time scientists named them, we already knew that earlier hominins walked upright too. The name stuck anyway, the way bad nicknames often do. But the label is less important than what it points to. A creature that crossed a threshold, anatomically and behaviourally, that no hominin before it had crossed. Here's the core picture. Sometime around 1.9 to 2 million years ago in Africa, a population of hominins began showing a cluster of traits that looked different from anything that came before. They were taller, significantly taller. Earlier hominins were compact, short-limbed, built more like something designed for climbing trees than covering ground. Homo erectus had long legs, narrow hips, a body plan that looks, when you see the skeleton, startlingly familiar. Not because it's identical to ours, but because you can immediately tell this was an animal built to move, built to cover distance, built for the open landscape rather than the forest edge. The skull changed too. The brain was larger than in earlier species, though we should be careful about what we mean by larger. It's not a straight line from small to big across 2 million years. Early Homo erectus brains were still significantly smaller than ours, but the expansion was real, and it was accompanied by a flatter face, a more pronounced brow ridge, and a body that had started shedding some of the ape-like features that defined earlier hominins. They were, in a phrase paleontologists sometimes use, the first humans who would have looked recognizably human from a distance. Now here's where the classification gets genuinely complicated. When scientists find fossils from different continents separated by hundreds of thousands of years, they have to make a judgment call about whether those fossils belong to the same species or related but distinct ones. Java man, found in Indonesia in the 1890s. Peking man, found in China decades later. Turkana boy, the nearly complete skeleton found in Kenya in 1984. These finds are separated by geography and time in ways that make lumping them together into one neat category scientifically uncomfortable. Some researchers prefer splitting the lineage into separate species: Homo ergaster for early African populations, Homo heidelbergensis for later ones. Others argue these distinctions are overdrawn, that the variation we're seeing is no greater than what you'd expect from any widely distributed animal living across millions of years of climate change. The honest answer is that both camps have a point. What we're looking at is probably more like a river than a single lake, a flow of populations connected across time, branching, merging, diverging, but never completely losing that thread of continuity that ties them together. When we say Homo erectus in this story, we mean the whole river. What made this particular river remarkable was where it went. Every hominin before Homo erectus appears to have stayed in Africa. That's not a criticism. Africa is an enormous continent with enormous environmental variety. But around 1.8 million years ago, something changed. Homo erectus populations began showing up outside Africa, and not just nearby, not just in the Sinai or the Levant. We're talking fossils from the Republic of Georgia, dated to around 1.8 million years ago. Fossils from Java, on an island in Southeast Asia, dated to somewhere between 1.5 and 1.8 million years ago, though those dates have been argued about extensively. Fossils from China suggesting occupation going back well over 1 million years. This matters enormously. It means Homo erectus didn't just survive in one place over 2 million years. It spread across 3 continents, adapted to radically different environments, and kept going. Tropical forests, open savanna, the cooler woodlands of temperate Asia, the cold steppe margins of northern China. They found ways to live in all of it. Dating those fossils is its own science, and it's worth pausing on how it actually works. The most reliable method for older material is radiometric dating, particularly potassium-argon dating for volcanic ash layers above and below fossil-bearing sediments. You can't date the bone directly most of the time, but you can date the geology that sandwiches it. Other methods include paleomagnetism, reading reversals in Earth's magnetic field preserved in ancient sediments, and electron spin resonance, which measures radiation damage accumulated in tooth enamel over time. Each method has error bars. Each new technique can revise a date that was previously considered settled, which is why the range for when Homo erectus first appeared and when the last populations finally disappeared keeps getting updated as new finds come in, and old samples get reanalyzed with better tools. Treat any specific number in this story as the current best estimate, not the final word. What the dates do tell us, with confidence, is that this lineage was persistent in a way that should stop us cold. 2 million years. To put that in perspective, modern humans have existed for somewhere around 300,000 years. We've been behaviourally modern, with art and complex symbolic culture, for perhaps 100,000. We've had agriculture for roughly 10,000. We've had written history for about 5,000. Homo erectus outlasted all of that by a factor that's almost impossible to hold in your head. They were around for so long that the oldest Homo erectus fossils and the youngest ones are separated by more time than separates us from them. Think about that for a moment. That kind of longevity isn't luck, it's resilience. It's the product of a body plan flexible enough to handle diverse environments, a social structure capable of maintaining knowledge across generations, and behavioural strategies that could bend without breaking when conditions shifted. Ice ages came and went. Sea levels rose and fell. Forests became grasslands, became forests again. And through all of it, these populations kept finding ways to persist. So here's the question that the whole story turns on. If Homo erectus was that durable, if it survived 2 million years of climate swings and environmental upheaval, what finally ended it? What combination of pressures was so specific, so relentless, or so unprecedented that a lineage forged over nearly 2 million years couldn't absorb the blow? That question is going to follow us through everything that comes next. But to start answering it, we need to understand how they actually lived. And that story begins with something deceptively simple. How they moved through the world. Start with movement. That's where the story of Homo erectus really becomes remarkable. Because spreading from Africa to Georgia to Java to northern China isn't something that happens by accident. It's not like a seed blown on the wind. It requires generations of sustained movement into unfamiliar territory, the ability to read new landscapes, find new food sources, survive new diseases, and keep going even when everything around you is strange. The body plan helps explain part of it. Those long legs weren't an aesthetic choice by evolution. Long legs mean longer stride, lower energy cost per kilometre, greater ground covered per calorie burned. When you're a forager, and your survival depends on knowing what's over the next ridge, that efficiency is the difference between finding food and not finding it. Homo erectus was built, almost literally, for the long walk. Narrow hips, high arches, a shoulder structure that had largely decoupled from the neck in ways that allowed the torso to counter-rotate during running. Biomechanically, this was an animal that could cover ground all day without exhausting itself, and when you put that body into a world of expanding grasslands, corridors of savanna stretching northeast out of Africa, the direction of movement becomes almost inevitable. The Levant was probably the first major stepping stone. That narrow corridor connecting Africa to Eurasia through what is now Israel and Palestine isn't just a geographic curiosity, it's a funnel. Populations moving north out of Africa would have been channeled through it, almost by default, following game, water, and seasonally productive vegetation. The Dmanisi fossils from Georgia, dated to around 1.8 million years ago, tell us that by the time we first have good evidence for Homo erectus outside Africa, they were already remarkably far north. Not just across the Sinai, but deep into the Caucasus, at the edge of the temperate zone where winters actually bite. That's a significant leap from tropical Africa. It suggests the movement through the Levant happened quickly enough in geological terms that we're missing most of the footprints. From the Levant, the roots branch. Populations moving east could follow the great arc of coastline and river systems through South Asia. The Indian subcontinent shows evidence of occupation going back over 1 million years, and the geography makes sense. Monsoon-fed rivers, productive floodplains, forests giving way to open woodland in ways that would have offered familiar foraging opportunities. Further east, Southeast Asia would have looked in many ways like a warmer, richer version of the African tropics. Dense forests, abundant fruit, large prey. The populations that eventually reached Java and possibly further had crossed environments that range from arid steppe to tropical coast, which means they weren't specialized for any single habitat. They were generalists, and generalism is exactly what long-distance dispersal selects for. But we should resist the temptation to picture this as a single heroic migration. A band of pioneers setting out with destination in mind. That's not how dispersal works in any species. What almost certainly happened was pulses. Populations expanding in good times, contracting during droughts or cold periods, pushing into new territory when resource pressure built up, retreating or dying out when conditions turned. The fossil record is too patchy to reconstruct the precise sequence, and the honest position is that we're seeing snapshots separated by enormous gaps. New finds keep reshuffling the timeline. A site in China pushed the evidence for northern occupation further back than most researchers expected. Reassessments of Indonesian dates have opened new arguments about which route populations took and when. The map of Homo erectus dispersal is still being drawn. What made each new latitude genuinely hard and not just geographically different was the combination of challenges that arrived together. Move far enough north, and the seasons start to dominate everything. Animals that are available in summer vanish or migrate in winter. Plants fruit on different schedules than anything your ancestors knew. The nights get long. The cold becomes a variable you have to solve every single day. Move into entirely new ecosystems, and the disease landscape shifts too. Parasites and pathogens that evolved alongside African mammals don't automatically follow you into temperate Asia, but new ones are waiting. Immune systems built by millions of years of African exposure face novel challenges in novel environments. The populations that survived in these places must have been filtering out vulnerability constantly, generation by generation, until the ones that remained were genuinely suited to where they lived, and prey. The megafauna of Eurasia and Southeast Asia was not identical to what Homo erectus ancestors knew in Africa. Straight-tusked elephants, steppe rhinos, giant deer, species that had never encountered a persistent, cooperative, tool-using predator. In some ways, that's an advantage. Naive prey is easier prey. But it also means learning from scratch which animals are dangerous, which are worth pursuing, how to read the behavior of something your lineage has never hunted before. All of this they managed. That's the thing that's easy to state and hard to actually absorb. They managed it not once, but repeatedly, across thousands of generations, in place after place. and yet the same geographic spread that demonstrates their adaptability also sets up the deepest puzzle in the story. A species that successfully colonized 3 continents, that bent itself to tropical forest and temperate steppe and island Southeast Asia, that persisted through climate cycles that would have extinguished less flexible lineages, eventually disappeared everywhere, not just in one marginal habitat at the edge of its range, but across the full breadth of the world it had conquered. Whatever ended Homo erectus, it wasn't a failure to adapt to new places. They had already proven they could do that, which means the force that finally stopped them was something different in kind, not just another challenge to be walked around. To really understand how they pulled this off, you have to look down from the big map and focus on what was in their hands. For a long time, Homo erectus is almost synonymous with one kind of object, a teardrop-shaped stone called a hand axe. Archaeologists call the broader tradition Acheulean, but the basic idea is simple enough. Take a fist-sized chunk of good stone and shape it into something with a sharp, continuous edge all the way around. Thick enough to hold, thin enough to cut. One tool that can butcher an animal, slice plant fibers, break open bones, scrape hides, maybe even dig. You see these things in East Africa around the time erectus appears, and then you start finding them further and further away. Same general concept, slightly different local accents. Some are finely symmetrical, almost eerily regular, like someone was following a mental blueprint. Others are cruder, more expedient, just enough shaping to get a working edge before moving on. But they're recognizably part of the same tradition, except not everywhere. Move into parts of East and Southeast Asia and the story changes. Suddenly, the classic hand axes are rare or absent. Instead, you get simpler cores and flakes, what used to be called the Mobius line distinction. Hand axes to the west, apparently no hand axes to the east. For decades this fueled arguments. Were Eastern Homo erectus somehow less advanced? Did they lose the hand axe technology on the way? Or is something else going on? More recent work suggests the less advanced story is too easy, and probably wrong. When you actually look at what stone is available in different regions, a more mundane explanation appears. In some places you have big, fine-grained cobbles that lend themselves to making large, symmetrical tools. In other places the raw material is small, fractured, or just not ideal for that kind of shaping. If your local river only gives you fist-sized chunks that shatter unpredictably, you don't invest hours trying to make museum-grade hand axes. You make what works, fast. Tool traditions vary regionally not because intelligence switches on and off as you cross mountains, but because technology is always a negotiation between what you know how to do and what the landscape will give you. Culture sits on geology, and even where the tools look simple, the decisions behind them are not. At a lot of erectus sites, the stone itself has a biography. The raw material came from miles away, sometimes tens of miles. That means someone recognized that a particular kind of rock made better edges, remembered where it was, carried it over long distances, and maybe even came back to the same source again and again. That is planning. Not just in the moment, but projected forward in time. We will need cutting tools later. We should bring this with us now. You also see repeated patterns. Similar shapes, similar flaking strategies, turning up at different sites in different layers over very long periods. That regularity is the archaeological shadow of teaching. Individual trial and error doesn't usually converge on the same pattern over and over, especially when there are many good enough ways to make something sharp. What we're seeing is probably young individuals watching older ones, practicing, being corrected, slowly internalizing not just the final form but the sequence of blows to get there. Even the use of poor quality stone can betray planning. In some locations you find expedient tools made from whatever was lying around, but concentrated in spots that look like kill or butchery sites. The high-quality, carefully prepared cores and hand axes are back closer to persistent camps or repeated use shelters. That suggests a mental division of labour between field gear and home gear. You take your good stuff where you know you'll be working for a while. You improvise on the spot when an opportunity appears. Over the 1,000,000+ years that erectus populations occupied different landscapes, there's a detectable shift in some regions from purely opportunistic cutting implements to more standardized forms. In early sites, the stone record can look chaotic. Flakes of all shapes and sizes, edges refreshed just wherever it was easiest to knock a chip off. By the time you get well into the Acheulean, some assemblages show tight clustering of hand axe sizes and shapes, implying people were aiming for specific designs. Standardization matters because it's about abstraction. You're no longer just solving the immediate problem of make edge sharp. You're working toward an internal model, a tool that you can picture before it exists. That's the intangible part, the thing a fossil can't show directly, but a pile of similarly shaped stones can hint at. Somewhere in those ancient brains there were concepts like good axe, and this is how a proper one looks. But if we only look at stone, we're seeing the skeleton of their technology, not the living body of it. Stone survives. Wood, fibre, leather, bark, and plant resins mostly don't, which means the vast majority of the erectus toolkit has simply vanished. Even in much later periods where we do start to get exceptional preservation, we see that stone often served as the cutting or piercing element for objects that were primarily organic: spears with wooden shafts and stone tips, handles bound with sinew, baskets woven from reeds, clothing stitched with plant fibre cord. There is no reason to think Homo erectus didn't do the same kinds of things, at least in simpler forms. A sharp-edged hand axe is good, but a sharpened wooden stake you can afford to lose might be better for certain tasks. A stone scraper is useful, but combine it with a hide stretched over a wooden frame, and suddenly you have a drying rack or a simple shelter. Even something as basic as a woven sling or carrying net doesn't leave obvious traces after hundreds of thousands of years, but it transforms daily life. Being able to move more food, firewood, or infants per trip isn't glamorous, but it's evolutionary gold. Adhesives are an especially invisible piece of the puzzle. Later humans used plant resins and bitumen to glue stone tools into wooden handles or spear shafts. Some Neanderthal tar production methods are downright sophisticated. It's possible that early experiments with sticky saps, chewed resins, or softened pitches go back into the erectus timeframe. If they did, those innovations would leave almost no clear signature in most archaeological contexts. Yet the cognitive leap required, recognizing that one substance can bond two others, learning how to process it, maybe even how to store it, would be immense. So we look at what's left and read between the chips. A scatter of butchered animal bones, associated with cut-marked surfaces and broken long bones, tells you about part of the day. Someone tracked, scavenged, or ambushed a large mammal. They brought at least some parts to a central place. Stone edges flashed through meat and sinew. Bones were cracked open, probably with hammerstones to get at marrow, the calorie-dense prize that makes the difference between surviving and thriving on a savanna diet. Elsewhere, concentrations of plant processing tools, grinders, pounders, stones worn smooth by repetitive motion, hint at other routines. Someone gathered nuts, seeds, or tubers, then invested time and effort making them edible. That grinding and pounding is usually not a solo activity. It lends itself to conversation, to teaching, to children underfoot imitating motions with smaller stones. The distribution of tools can even sketch the outline of a day's movement. Heavier cores and finished hand axes cluster in what look like long-term or repeatedly used spots. Lighter flakes and quickly made implements string out along riverbanks, near waterholes, or at vantage points where someone could sit and watch herds. It's as if the landscape is marked not only by where they slept, but by where they paused for half an hour to cut, to pry, to shape. And behind all of this is sharing. Large animals rarely fall neatly into one family's worth of meat. When a group of Homo erectus brought down or found a big carcass, the stone record suggests multiple individuals working on it. That implies multiple mouths to feed. The tools, in that sense, are frozen moments of cooperation. Yet there's a paradox built into these same tools. On one hand, innovation stabilizes life. A sharper hand axe means faster butchery and less time exposed to scavengers. A standardized toolkit means you can move into new terrain with a reliable set of solutions already mentally packed. Learning to transport good stone from distant sources buffers you against local shortages. All of that makes daily existence a little less precarious, which in evolutionary terms is enormous. On the other hand, technological traditions can become anchors. Once a way of doing things works, once it's been taught and refined and wrapped in social learning, it doesn't always adapt quickly when the environment shifts abruptly. A population whose entire hunting and processing system is tuned to open grassland herds might struggle when forest spreads and prey behavior changes. A toolkit optimized for one kind of stone becomes less effective when that stone disappears from the routes you travel. The archaeological record hints at both resilience and lag. There are stretches of hundreds of thousands of years where Acheulean hand axes change very little, even as climates pulse through glacial and interglacial cycles. That persistence could be read as success, the tools kept working, but it also meant that when change finally exceeded the range those tools could comfortably handle, when prey species, vegetation or weather patterns crossed some threshold, adjustment had to happen fast, or not at all. For Homo erectus, the toolkit that allowed them to be the first humans to stride from Africa to the edges of Eurasia was both armour and vulnerability. It captured hard-won solutions to life on a restless planet, but it could never perfectly keep pace with a world that refused to stop changing, and the next piece of that armour, the one that would extend their reach even further and alter their relationship to danger, darkness and each other, was something they didn't carry in their hands at all. It was something they tamed. Fire. For most animals, sunset is a hard stop. Vision drops off. Temperatures fall. Big predators that see well in low light take over the shift. The safest move is to hunker down and wait for dawn. Once Homo erectus began to tame fire, that rule started to bend. The tricky part is, we don't know exactly when that happened, or how often. Fire doesn't fossilize neatly. Ash gets blown away. Charcoal burns again. Old hearths are disturbed by burrowing animals, root systems, later humans. So archaeologists are stuck trying to read smoke stains on stone, microscopic bits of burned bone, and oddly heated sediments. There are sites more than 1 million years old that some researchers claim show evidence of controlled fire, places in East Africa, Israel, China, with lenses of reddened earth, scattered charcoal and stone tools nearby. Some even have what look like concentrated patches of burned bone, suggesting repeated fires in the same spot, not just a single lightning strike that torched a patch of grass. But every one of these early claims has an asterisk. Natural processes can fake the signal. A grass fire swept by the wind can leave a patchy layer of ash. Lightning can set tree roots smouldering underground, baking soil from below. Later fires can burn down through older sediments and make it look like something much earlier was heated. Even the neat circular patterns we want to read as hearths can be produced by wind, water or animal activity. So the debate is ongoing. Some archaeologists argue that Homo erectus had regular controlled use of fire by around 1 million years ago, maybe earlier. Others think sporadic, opportunistic use is more likely, grabbing smouldering branches after a wildfire, keeping them going for a while, then losing the flame and waiting for the next natural ignition. Still others are cautious and push habitual reliable fire use much later, closer to 400 to 500,000 years ago. What almost everyone agrees on, though, is that once fire became a tool they could make and remake at will, it changed everything. Even the simplest uses are transformative. Start with warmth. A body designed for walking long distances under a hot sun is not automatically well suited to sudden cold snaps or chilly nights on a high plateau. Fire lets a thin, lightly furred primate colonize places that would otherwise be seasonally lethal. Those marginal habitats, edges of deserts, foothills, open woodlands that swing wildly between daytime heat and nighttime chill, suddenly become open for business. Then there's safety. A small group with nothing but sticks and stones is easy competition for a pack of hyenas or a curious lion, especially in the dark. Add fire and the balance shifts. Many large predators are wary of flame. A ring of burning branches, embers thrown at bold scavengers, flickering light that reveals movement at the edge of camp. Together they turn the immediate area around a group into a defensive bubble. The light itself is a revolution. Daylight hours are expensive. You're moving, foraging, scanning for danger. You can't relax for long. With fire, there's suddenly a new kind of time. Hours after dusk when bodies are physically tired, but the immediate chores are done and the circle of light feels relatively safe. That time can be filled with grooming, tool repair, teaching, quiet talk, or just shared presence. We can't listen in on Homo erectus conversations, but we can see what happens to social animals that get reliable, secure downtime. They strengthen bonds. They transmit skills. They organize plans for tomorrow. Over hundreds of thousands of years, even small increments of extra social time every night could ratchet up the complexity of cooperation. And then, of course, there's cooking. Raw meat and raw tubers can keep you alive, but they are costly. You have to chew extensively. Your gut has to work hard to extract nutrients. Some potential foods are practically locked away behind tough fibers, toxins or starches your enzymes struggle with. Apply heat and the chemistry shifts. Proteins denature, starches gelatinize. Many plant toxins break down, pathogens die. Suddenly, the same landscape yields more usable calories per hour of foraging. The cooking made us human idea, that fire and cooked food alone explain our small guts, big brains and social lives, is probably too neat. Evolution rarely runs on a single-track story, but it's hard to avoid the conclusion that cooking stacked the odds. If you can get more energy out of the same amount of food, you can afford a more energetically expensive brain. If meals take less time to chew and digest, more of the day is freed for other activities, teaching, toolmaking, childcare, exploration. If even tough roots and fibrous seeds become soft enough for infants and the elderly to eat, survival improves at both ends of the lifespan. Multiply those advantages across hundreds or thousands of generations, and you're not surprised to see populations able to support more children or have them closer together. That doesn't mean fire single-handedly triggered a population boom. Climate shifts, changing prey species, and other technologies all matter, but fire is one of those force multipliers that makes every other adaptation work a little better. The physical traces of this shift show up in places that look, for all their alien strangeness, a bit like familiar camps. At some sites associated with Homo erectus and their close relatives, you find repeated layers of occupation with concentrations of burned material in roughly the same spots. Reddened patches of sediment, ashes turn to compact greyish streaks, charred bone fragments intermixed with stone tools. Not random scatters, but clusters. They're rarely the tidy fire circles of a modern campsite. Erosion and time smear everything. But the pattern repeats enough that many researchers see the outlines of routines. This is where we put the fire, this is where we drop the bones, this is where we sit. A hearth, in that sense, is more than a patch of burned earth. It's a reference point. If your group returns to the same rock shelter season after season, year after year, the old fire spot becomes an anchor in space and memory. You know where the good sleeping ledges are relative to it. You know where the prevailing wind usually blows the smoke. You remember where embers tend to roll, where children shouldn't play too close. The presence of such hearth-like features hints at a mental map that includes not just water sources and game trails, but the microgeography of comfort, best spots for warmth, for smoke escape, for watching the entrance. In that glowing centre, meat is roasted, tubers are baked in ashes, stories, whatever their exact form, are told. The night itself changes character around a fire. Without flame, darkness is a wall. You might hear the cough of a leopard, the whoop of hyenas, the rustle of something large moving in grass, but you can't see it. You curl up where you hope you're hidden and wait. Any movement feels risky. With fire, the wall becomes a zone. Inside the circle of light you can see faces, hands, expressions. Just beyond it, eyeshine flickers and disappears. Further out, sounds are still mysterious, but you're not utterly blind. Risks don't vanish, but they're pushed back, given contour. For a species trying to make a living among large carnivores, that shift in perceived risk matters. Even if fires failed sometimes, even if a bold predator occasionally tested the boundary, the average night became less deadly. Fewer fatal surprises per decade translate into more surviving children, more old individuals who remember dry years and strange migrations, more continuity. The cold, too, becomes something you can manage instead of something that simply happens to you. A sudden chill wind or an unexpected drop in night temperatures is dangerous for a lightly built primate with little fur. A group with fire can huddle closer, feed the flames higher, adjust sleeping positions. The difference between everyone wakes up and some don't wake at all might be a good pile of dry wood gathered before sundown. But like every powerful technology, fire cuts both ways. Once a population leans heavily on flame, for cooking, for warmth, for night defense, it quietly rewires its relationship to the environment. Diets shift toward foods that are best eaten cooked. Daily rhythms assume the existence of a bright, warm center in the evening. Settlement choices start to favor places with good fuel supplies and shelter from wind so fires will burn predictably. That dependence becomes a kind of invisible vulnerability. Imagine a run of seasons when rain is relentless, and every piece of wood you can find is soaked. Or a dust-laden wind that makes sparks dangerous, forcing you to keep flames low. or a sudden move into terrain where suitable fuel is sparse or burns poorly. For a group that still treats fire as a useful bonus, those conditions are unpleasant. For a group that has reorganized its whole way of living around reliable fire, they are more than that. They are stress tests. At larger scales, climate swings can magnify the problem. Colder, drier periods might make fuel scarce in some regions, just as the cold makes warmth more critical. Shifts in vegetation could turn once forested zones into scrub or grassland, changing both the kind and amount of burnable material. A species that's spread into marginal habitats thanks to fire may find those margins suddenly unforgiving when the equation of heat, fuel, and shelter changes. There's also the question of what happens when multiple human species, all fire users, collide in the same landscape. If Homo erectus in one region has a finely tuned system for finding fuel, maintaining hearths, and cooking certain staple foods, and then climate pushes them into competition with other humans whose fire strategies are slightly different, small differences in flexibility could matter. Those who can switch fuel sources, adjust camp patterns, or alter cooking methods faster may weather abrupt change better. In that sense, fire sits right at the center of the extinction puzzle. It is one of the great strengths of these early humans, a tool that let them push into new frontiers, survive cold nights, and wring more energy out of hard-won food. But it's also a potential failure point. The more deeply a way of life is built around the assumption that you can always make and keep a flame, the more brittle it becomes when the world conspires to take that flame away. For nearly 2 million years, Homo erectus walked that line, turning lightning and dry branches into culture, carving out a night world where their kind could laugh, plan, and eat in relative safety, while the rest of the savannah slept or hunted in the dark. Around those long-forgotten fires, another part of their story was unfolding as well, who shared the food, who watched the children, who tended the flames while others slept. To see how they endured not just as individuals, but as families and bands across unthinkable stretches of time, we have to step closer to that circle of light and watch how they treated each other. When we talk about Homo erectus, it's tempting to picture a lone, rugged survivor striding across some empty plain. But that's not how primates live, and it's almost certainly not how they did either. They were social apes who had to solve social problems day after day for hundreds of thousands of years. We don't have their villages. We don't have their songs, their arguments, or their love stories. What we do have are scatters of bones and stones, repeated patterns in how those bones and stones show up, and one powerful clue, the way other hunter-gatherers live when they have to survive by their wits and their cooperation, rather than by agriculture or industrial technology. Put those lines of evidence together, and a rough picture starts to emerge. First, group size. Even without written records, there are constraints that social mammals can't easily break. A small band needs enough adults to defend itself, find food, raise young, and keep the gene pool healthy. But it can't get too big, or it strips the local area of resources and spends all its time just walking to the next patch. Modern hunter-gatherers tend to live in bands of maybe 20 to 50 people who know each other intimately, with looser ties to a larger community of a few hundred individuals they can marry into, trade with, or join in a crisis. When archaeologists look at Homo erectus sites, the densities of artifacts and butchered bones, the size of living floors, the number of repeated occupations, all point in roughly the same direction. Groups large enough to cooperate, small enough to move. You can imagine a core of related families, siblings, cousins, in-laws, travelling together, sometimes splitting into smaller foraging parties, sometimes gathering into a bigger group when a carcass is too big or a threat is too serious. If that sounds familiar, it should. It's basically what our own species did for most of its history. And there's no reason to think Homo erectus was radically different on that front. But group size is just the starting point. The real question is, how tight were those bonds? How far did cooperation go? This is where the bones talk. At some sites attributed to Homo erectus and closely related species, we see individuals with healed injuries that would have been catastrophic in the wild, badly broken limbs that knit back together in ways that suggest months of limited mobility, serious infections that left marks on bone but didn't kill the person immediately. In later humans, even teeth worn down to the roots, meaning that person must have been fed softer food to stay alive. You don't get that kind of healing if you're on your own. An individual who can't walk well, can't chase prey, can't easily gather roots, can't keep up with a fast-moving band. If they survive long enough for serious breaks to heal, someone has been bringing them food, sharing water, maybe helping them move when the group relocates. We're used to thinking of compassion as a kind of luxury of modern civilization. The archaeological record suggests it's much older than that, not because our ancestors were saints, but because in small interdependent groups, keeping a wounded or older member alive can be a surprisingly good strategy. An elder who can no longer hunt might still know where water persisted during the last drought, which plants make you sick, which hidden valley held game when everything else was barren. A once strong hunter laid up with a bad leg might sit by the fire, explaining to the teenagers exactly how to read an animal's tracks, or where to strike with a spear. Caring for them isn't just kindness, it's investment in a living library. That brings us to learning and tradition. Every Homo erectus tool you see in a museum, the hand axe, the cleaver, the carefully flaked scraper, represents more than a clever idea. It represents someone watching and copying someone else, over and over, until the right way to strike a core of stone stopped being a discovery and became a tradition. You don't get standardized tool forms scattered across continents and lasting for hundreds of thousands of years if each individual is reinventing the technique from scratch. You get them when children grow up watching adults snap stone, being corrected when they mess it up, being praised when they finally get the edge just right. Ethnographers who study modern foragers find the same thing. Vital survival skills take years to master. Tracking animals, reading subtle shifts in weather, knowing which route is safe in one season and deadly in another. You don't cram that knowledge in a weekend. There's a long learning curve. Childhood is, in a sense, an apprenticeship in how not to die. For Homo erectus, that apprenticeship was probably already well developed, even if it wasn't as extended as in our own species. We can see hints of this in their biology. As brains get larger, gestation length can only stretch so far before birth becomes mechanically impossible. The solution primates repeatedly hit on is to offload more development into the years after birth. Babies are born relatively helpless and stay dependent longer. Childhood stretches out. Adolescence becomes a real phase instead of a brief transition. Fossil skulls from earlier hominins suggest that this slow-growing, long-learning pattern was already underway before Homo erectus fully emerged, and it intensified in them. Their brain cases are larger than earlier forms, their bodies more committed to a high-endurance, high-information lifestyle. That implies a life history strategy, where juveniles stay close, watch closely, and need years of practice to become truly competent adults. Now imagine what that does to a group. If your survival depends on a long pipeline of learning, then your social world has to protect that pipeline. Adults can't just focus on their own immediate needs. They have to invest time and energy in teaching. Older siblings and cousins end up helping with childcare. Grandparents, or the Homo erectus equivalent, become important, not for their muscles, but for their memories. A species like that is buffered not just by its genes, but by its culture. Cultural buffering is a simple idea with huge consequences. Shared know-how can cushion a group against environmental chaos. If you know 10 different ways to find food, a drought that wipes out 3 of them doesn't instantly kill you. If generations have tested which unfamiliar plants make good emergency rations and which are poison, your odds of surviving a sudden shift in vegetation go way up. If you've learned techniques for storing food or rotating camp locations, or reading subtle signs of weather change, you're not at the mercy of every bad year. Homo erectus lived through wild climate swings, glacial advances and retreats, shifts from woodland to grassland and back again, pulses of aridity that turned lakes into dust bowls. Their stone tools barely change in overall style for astonishing lengths of time, but that apparent sameness may hide a flexible, adaptive knowledge system, subtle tweaks in how tools were used, which animals were targeted, how camps were organized, what routes were taken across the landscape. From the outside, it looks monotonous. Hand axes for 1,000,000 years. From the inside, it may have felt like a constantly updated playbook. Today we hunt this way, because the herds are further north. This year we camp higher, because the valley floods. This decade we rely more on routes, because the big game is scarce. And crucially, those adjustments don't require genetic evolution. They can happen within a generation, even within a single lifetime, as long as your social fabric is dense enough to spread new tricks fast. Cooperation is the engine that makes that cultural buffering work. Sharing food is risky. Why give away calories you sweated for? But in a world with unpredictable returns, sharing can be the best insurance policy. You bring back a big kill today and distribute meat widely. Next month, when you come back empty-handed, someone else's luck covers your bad run. Gossip, reputation, and long memories enforce the system. Chronic freeloaders are remembered, excluded, or given the worst tasks. Over hundreds of thousands of years, such systems can become finely tuned. Who gets first access to meat? Who watches children while others hunt? Who tends the fire? Who decides when to move camp? You don't need formal chiefs or written laws to generate complex norms. Repeated interaction and the ever-present threat of starvation are enough. From all this, one thing becomes clear. Homo erectus didn't survive for nearly 2 million years just because they had good legs and sharp stones. They survived because they had each other, and because they built ways of living together that could ride out shocks that would have obliterated less cooperative, less organized animals. Which brings us to a strange, unsettling question. If these social strategies were so powerful, if family care, long childhoods, shared traditions and cultural buffering could carry them through ice ages, droughts, predators and volcanic winters, why did they eventually fail? Why did a species that had cracked the code of long-term survival, that had spread from Africa to Asia and maybe beyond, that had turned cooperation into a survival weapon, ultimately disappear from the fossil record? Something changed. Either the environment pushed beyond the limits their culture could buffer, or new competitors emerged whose own social systems were even more flexible, more information-rich, more ruthless, or both. For now, we leave Homo erectus in their world of bands and hearths, of injured elders being fed, of children learning to nap stone by firelight, of knowledge trickling down the generations like an unbroken thread. Beyond the horizon, the climate is about to lurch again. Ice will advance, seas will fall, corridors will open and close, and into those shifting landscapes other humans will eventually step. Humans shaped by the same deep logic of family and cooperation, but armed with slightly different tools. The question is whether that difference was enough to tip a 2 million year success story into a slow, irrevocable decline. If you look at a graph of Earth's climate over the last 2 million years, it doesn't look like a gentle wave. It looks like a jagged saw blade. Up, down, over and over. That's the Pleistocene climate engine, the world Homo erectus was born into, and the one they somehow learned to ride. On long timescales, the big driver was orbital mechanics. Tiny changes in the way Earth circles the Sun and tilts on its axis changed how much sunlight different latitudes got at different times of year. On paper, that sounds mild. In reality, it meant ice sheets could grow to cover whole continents and then retreat again, dozens of times. But Ice Age is a misleading phrase. It makes you picture a static, frozen world. In truth, it was a machine for creating change. At the height of a glacial period, yes, there were vast ice sheets over northern Europe, Asia and North America. Sea levels could drop more than 100 meters. Deserts expanded, forests shrank, rain belts shifted hundreds of kilometers. Then, over a few thousand years, a blink in geological terms, the system would flip. Ice sheets melted back, seas rose, grasslands invaded former tundra, forests recolonized valleys that had been cold, open steppe. To a creature with a lifespan of 40 or 50 years, this wasn't some slow background hum. It was felt as pulses of disruption. A grandparent might remember a river that no longer flowed in their grandchildren's time. A hunting route that had worked for generations might suddenly become useless because the herds changed their path, or the marsh they relied on for reeds and fish dried up. And this didn't happen once. It happened again and again, layered on top of shorter regional swings, decades-long droughts, sudden cold snaps, weird flickers where climates seesawed back and forth before settling. Now imagine trying to make a living under that sky. For Homo erectus, the world was never finished. Coastlines moved, lakes came and went, mountain passes that had been open for centuries filled with snow and became impassable. What had been a continuous stretch of forest could fragment into isolated patches surrounded by grassland or scrub. On a global map, it looks like someone keeps redrawing the board. From their perspective, the land itself was unreliable. Sea level is a good example. When ice sheets lock up enough water, the oceans fall. Continental shelves that are underwater today become dry land. Shallow seas turn into low, flat plains crisscrossed by rivers. During some glacial periods, Southeast Asia wasn't a puzzle of islands the way it is now. It was a broad, continuous landmass we call Sunda, linking what's now the Malay Peninsula with Sumatra, Borneo and Java. To Homo erectus, that meant whole new hunting grounds when the seas were low, and isolation when the seas rose again and drowned the corridors they had used. The same thing happened in Africa and Eurasia. Land bridges would emerge, then vanish. Estuaries retreated miles outward, then flooded back inland. Good coastal campsites might end up far from the shore or under 30 meters of water. So how do you survive when the map under your feet won't hold still? One answer is, you move. Homo erectus had already paid the initial cost of becoming a long-distance walker. Their legs were built for covering ground efficiently. Their bodies could handle heat with sweating and long, steady exertion. In a world of shifting resources, that physiology was a superpower. As climate zones slid around them, they didn't stay anchored to one patch and starve. They followed the game. If herds pushed up into cooler highlands during a warm phase, groups could probe those slopes, test out new camps, learn new routes. When cold returned and grasslands expanded downslope, they could track the animals back, abandoning forests that no longer paid off. You can see hints of this in the spread of their fossils and tools. Over hundreds of thousands of years, Homo erectus sites appear in places that, at different times, would have been woodland, open savanna, river valley, coastal fringe. They weren't specialists locked into one niche. They were generalists who learned to operate at the seams between niches. Those seams, mixed habitats, were often the best bets in a volatile world. Where forest met grassland, there were browsers and grazers, fruits and roots, birds and small mammals. If drought thinned the forest fruits, the open country might still support grazing herds. If cold reduced the insect swarms near rivers, the surrounding woodland might still hold edible tubers. Living near those ecological borderlands gave them options, and options are everything when climate is a moving target. But even a mobile, flexible species hits limits. Sometimes the changes were so extreme, or so fast regionally, that whole areas became death traps. When that happened, survival meant finding refugia, places where local conditions buffered the worst of the global swings. A canyon with a spring that never quite dried up, fed by deep aquifers. A coastal strip where upwelling currents kept marine life productive even when inland rains failed. A broad river system with complex wetlands that shrank but didn't vanish during droughts, or that stayed ice-free in parts during cold spells. These refugees were the Pleistocene equivalent of lifeboats. Populations that found them and learned their rhythms could shrink back during bad times, riding out cold or drought with reduced numbers, then expand outward again when conditions eased. Over long timescales, this creates a pattern. Local extinctions in some areas, recolonization from refugia in others. From the outside, that looks like a species blinking in and out across the map. But at the global level, the line of continuity persists. It's very likely Homo erectus went through multiple demographic squeezes, local or even continental bottlenecks where numbers dropped sharply, without disappearing as a species. Some lineages winked out completely. Others, tucked away in some more stable pocket of habitat, hung on. When the climate engine shifted back toward their favour, those survivors spread again, carrying the torch forward, and again and again. This has an important implication. Being Ice Age survivors doesn't mean standing proudly on some icy ridge while glaciers roar past. It means getting very good at not being there when the worst hits. It means timing movements so you arrive in a valley just as seasonal pools fill, or backing off a plateau before winter snow makes it lethal. It means knowing, in transmitted stories or in hard-earned memory, that there is always a greener patch 3 days walk east, if you leave in time. And it means that Ice Age, as a single label, hides enormous local diversity. While an ice sheet advanced over northern Europe, parts of East Africa might have been in a relatively mild, dry phase. Stressful, but not catastrophic. While monsoon patterns weakened in one region, they might have intensified somewhere else, turning marginal lands into temporary oases of productivity. For a species spread from Africa into Eurasia and Southeast Asia, there was never a single, synchronized experience of the Ice Age. Some Homo erectus bands were dealing with cold steppe and sparse vegetation. Others were navigating fluctuating savannas with scattered trees. Others were exploiting coastal lagoons, estuaries, and mangrove belts that came and went with the sea. Local conditions mattered more than the global label, and local strategies made the difference between continuity and oblivion. Those strategies weren't just about legs and lungs, they were about information. Knowing when the rains usually failed, knowing which valley still held permanent water, knowing that certain high ground caught morning fog that could be collected. This was climate technology just as much as a hand axe was, and in a world of repeated glacial-interglacial cycles, knowledge like that was stress-tested again and again. Every bad swing was a kind of exam. Had the group preserved enough memory of how to cope? Had they maintained ties with neighbouring bands who might offer refuge or share routes? Had they diversified their diet enough that when the big animals moved away, they could fall back on smaller game, shellfish, roots, insects? If the answer was yes often enough, their genes and traditions kept flowing forward. If not, their tools and bones ended up as lonely terminal data points in the fossil record. When you stretch that process across nearly 2 million years, one thing becomes clear. Resilience wasn't a one-time achievement for Homo erectus. It was a recurring performance. They passed the test of climate chaos not once, but dozens of times, which leads to a sobering thought. If multiple glacial cycles, shifting coastlines, vanishing lakes and recurring droughts weren't enough to erase them, then whatever finally did must have intersected with their world in a different way. Maybe it wasn't simply colder than ever or drier than ever, but rather the wrong kind of change in the wrong place at the wrong time, hitting key refugia instead of peripheral habitats, shredding the networks they depended on, or compressing multiple stresses into a time frame their cultural buffering couldn't handle. Or maybe it wasn't the climate acting alone, because as those ice ages rolled on, the stage was getting crowded. New human forms were emerging, shaped by the same climate engine but armed with slightly different bodies, brains and traditions. The cycles that Homo erectus had endured for so long didn't stop. But late in their story, the pattern of winners and losers within those cycles began to shift, and in some of the very regions that had once been their strongholds, those shifts would prove fatal. To understand how a species that shrugged off almost 2 million years of chaos finally disappeared, you have to stop looking at the whole map and start looking at the corners. By the time our own lineage was beginning to split and diversify, Homo erectus wasn't evenly spread from Africa to China anymore. Their range had thinned. In some places they'd already been replaced by newer forms of humans or pushed into ecological sidelines. But in a few pockets they held on. Those pockets, the last strongholds, are where the mystery really lives. If you plot the youngest possible dates for Homo erectus sites, a pattern jumps out. Again and again, arguments about their final chapters lead you back to Asia, and especially to one place, the island of Java, off the coast of what is now Indonesia. Java is where Homo erectus was first identified, in the 1890s, from fossils pulled out of river terraces along the Solo River. Names like Trinil, Sanggaran, Ngandong, Sambung Makan sound obscure, but in paleoanthropology, they're like coordinates in a crime scene diagram. This is where much of the debate about their survival plays out. For a long time, the standard story was simple. Homo erectus in Java were old, really old, hundreds of thousands of years, impressive for early explorers out of Africa, but nowhere near the time window when our own species was rising to dominance. Then, in the late 20th century, new dates began to whisper something different. At Ngandong, a collection of skullcaps and leg bones turned up in deposits along ancient river channels. Dating work in the 1990s suggested they might be astonishingly young, on the order of 50,000 years old. That would mean Homo erectus on Java hanging on until the same broad time frame when Homo sapiens were painting caves in Europe and spreading into Australia. If that were true, it would turn the late Pleistocene into a crowded, tangled drama. Modern humans, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and raw, stubborn Homo erectus all on the stage at once. But the Earth doesn't make mysteries easy. Those Ngandong fossils weren't sitting in neat, undisturbed layers like books on a shelf. They were found in reworked river deposits, sediments that had been eroded, transported, and laid down again. Imagine tearing pages out of a dozen history books, shuffling them, and dropping them into a ditch. Now try to put them back in order using only the colour of the paper and the way the ink has faded. That's what dating a lot of late Homo erectus sites is like. When you date the sediment, what exactly are you dating? The moment the bone was buried, or the moment the river last rearranged its bed and dumped older material into a new position. If a flood chews through a bank, picks up skeletons from an ancient terrace, and then lays them down with younger sand, your age signal becomes a mixture. This is why you'll hear wildly different claims about how long Homo erectus survived on Java. More recent studies using multiple techniques, uranium series dating, argon-argon on volcanic layers, luminescence on the sediments themselves, have pushed the Ngandong fossils back. Instead of 50,000 years, they seem more likely to be in the range of about 100,000 to 150,000 years old. Some analyses cluster them even earlier. In other words, still late, still remarkable, but not overlapping directly with cave artists in Europe. Even that, though, is a statistical cloud, not a single precise number. Each method has error bars. Each sample has its own history. Bulldozers and erosion and decades of quarrying have churned many of these sites before scientists got to them. When you're arguing over whether the last embers of a species burned out 100,000 years ago or 200,000 years ago, those uncertainties matter. Java isn't the only suspect. On mainland China, sites like Zhoukoudian near Beijing, with its famous Peking man fossils, were once thought to show very late Homo erectus survival. More refined dating has tended to shift those remains older, closer to 500,000 years or more, but the region as a whole still hints at extended occupation by erectus-like populations, and sprinkled across Southeast Asia and neighbouring regions there are fragmentary finds, isolated teeth, a partial skull here, a bit of jaw there, that look archaic, that don't fit neatly into Homo sapiens or Neanderthals. Are some of these late Homo erectus? Are they something transitional? Are we looking at multiple lineages, all evolving in parallel? The farther you look into this period, the fuzzier the species boundaries become. But if the dates and labels are still being fought over, the environments these last groups lived in are a little easier to reconstruct. Take late Homo erectus in Java. During many cold, glacial phases, Java wasn't a lonely island at all. It was part of the Greater Sunda Shelf, a broad extension of mainland Southeast Asia created when sea levels dropped. Rivers ran across huge lowland plains. Coastal zones stepped outward tens of kilometres. What is now an archipelago was for them a connected sprawl of floodplains, estuaries, and forest edge mosaics. That's exactly the kind of environment Homo erectus had always favoured, the seams between habitats. River valleys offered water, fish, and predictable animal paths. Floodplains grew rich grasses that drew grazing herds. Just beyond, patches of woodland and forest supplied fruits, nuts, and tubers. And where those forests met the open country, smaller mammals and birds foraged. Prey that could be trapped or clubbed when the big game failed. Coastal plains added another layer. Tidal flats, mangroves, shellfish beds, stranded fish and shrinking pools. In a world where inland conditions could swing from wet to dry, having a marine backup plan was valuable. These are the settings you expect to see strongholds, places where a flexible generalist could retreat when other regions became too cold, too dry, or too unpredictable. But there's a catch. The same geography that makes a refuge can also turn it into a trap. When seas are low and Sunda is one great connected landmass, Homo erectus can wander widely, tracking resources, exchanging mates with neighbouring bands, maintaining a healthy flow of genes and ideas. When ice melts and seas rise, those corridors flood. Broad plains pinch into peninsulas. Peninsulas fracture into islands. If your group happens to be on a piece of high ground that becomes tomorrow's Java, your world shrinks without you having to move a muscle. For a while, that might not matter. The local rivers still flow. The coastal strip still teems with life. Forest patches still dot the interior. If anything, isolation might protect you from whatever is happening on the mainland. New predators, new competitors, new diseases. Evolutionary biologists have a word for this. Refugial isolation. A lineage gets tucked away in a pocket of suitable habitat, buffered from outside change. Inside that pocket, it can persist in a kind of time capsule, preserving older traits while the rest of the world moves on. But isolation is a double-edged sword. Cut off from larger populations, your numbers are limited by the local ecology. A few thousand individuals at most, perhaps only hundreds, scattered along river systems and coastal belts. Random events, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, disease outbreaks, a prolonged shift in monsoon patterns, hit harder when you don't have a vast hinterland of relatives who can send migrants to refill the gaps. Your genetic diversity narrows. Innovation slows if you don't have many neighbouring groups to trade ideas with. If something new and disruptive appears just across the water, a different kind of human with slightly better tools, or different hunting strategies, or just a tendency to breed faster, you don't have many options. You can't simply walk away across a drowned shelf. The same logic applies to other suspected strongholds. In mainland East Asia, late Homo erectus or rectus-like populations seem to cluster in big river systems and basin edges, the Yellow River, the Yangtze, complex networks of tributaries and loess plateaus. These landscapes, with their mix of steppe, woodland and riparian corridors, could buffer climate swings just as Java's floodplains did. But if climatic bands shifted north and south, if forests retreated upslope, if new hominin forms expanded in from the west or south, those once central refuges could turn into pockets of last resort. So when we talk about the last Homo erectus, we're not picturing a single proud band of holdouts making a last stand on some cliff. We're talking about scattered archipelagos of survival, some littoral islands like Java, some ecological islands like river basins hemmed in by less hospitable terrain. In each of these places the same basic question hovers: were they thriving or just hanging on? Did late Homo erectus on Java live for hundreds of thousands of years as stable, successful hunter-gatherers, well tuned to their rivers and coastal mosaics? Or did they spend that time on a demographic knife edge, their numbers rising and falling with every change in sea level and monsoon strength, their world slowly getting smaller? Were the strongholds true refuges, where life went on much as it had for ages, or were they more like lifeboats adrift on an increasingly dangerous sea? The bones and stones don't answer that cleanly. A site that looks young might just be the last time conditions were right for fossils to form, not the last time the species was there. Gaps in the record could mean local extinctions, or simply that later layers were eroded away. But everything we know about the Pleistocene, about small scattered populations and about the math of isolation, points in the same direction. By their final chapters, these Homo erectus populations were probably living close to the edge, not just once, in some dramatic crisis, but repeatedly, riding out swings they had no way to predict in detail, with fewer allies and fewer escape routes than their ancestors had enjoyed. And as the climate engine kept grinding on, and new kinds of humans began to move through the same landscapes, the old survival tricks that had worked for so long were coming under pressure. The last strongholds were holding, for now, but beyond their horizons the world they depended on was changing in ways that would soon test every assumption their lineage had ever made about how to survive, and nowhere would that test be more intense than in the shifting, flood-prone, resource-rich maze of Southeast Asia. To see what that really meant, you have to zoom in on the map at exactly the place where their luck, and maybe their time, ran out. Today, when you look at Southeast Asia, you see a scatter of islands: Sumatra, Java, Borneo, Bali, Lombok, Sulawesi, a whole spray of smaller dots trailing off toward Australia. It looks like a broken necklace. For most of Homo erectus history, that's not what it looked like. Drop sea level by just 50 or 60 meters, and the ocean pulls back like a curtain. Drop it by 100, and an entirely different world appears: the Sunda Shelf. The Sunda Shelf is a broad, shallow platform of continental crust that stretches out from mainland Southeast Asia under what is now the Java Sea, the South China Sea, and the Straits of Malacca. When ice piled up at the poles during glacial periods, global sea levels fell, and this drowned platform turned into dry land. Instead of an archipelago, you'd see one sprawling subcontinent: the Malay Peninsula welded to Sumatra, Java joined to Borneo, long river systems meandering across vast lowland plains toward coasts that were tens or even hundreds of kilometers farther out. Only a few deep channels remained as true seas. For Homo erectus that was an invitation. Low, gently rolling plains with braided rivers, flood plains, swamps, coastal lagoons, huge stretches of ecotone, the boundaries between forest and open country, they'd always exploited so well. Herd animals moving across grasslands in seasonal patterns, forest edges rich in fruits, nuts, tubers, and small game, estuaries loaded with fish and shellfish. In these low-stand worlds, groups could travel enormous distances without ever losing access to water or cover. Bands hunting on what is now central Java could, in principle, be part of a loose network stretching back through Sumatra to the mainland. Gene flow, idea flow, slow but steady. But the Sunda world was never static. It breathed. Every time the planet's orbit shifted just enough, every time ice sheets grew or shrank in response to small changes in sunlight, that shelf flickered between land and sea. During some glacial phases, the plains expanded, rivers lengthened, deltas marched seaward. During warmer interglacials, ice melted, sea levels rose, and the ocean surged back over the shelf. Land bridges pinched into narrow corridors and then snapped. Peninsulas that had once been thoroughfares turned into cul-de-sacs, then into islands. From the point of view of Homo erectus, this meant their geography was on a slow, relentless dimmer switch. If you were born during a low stand, your world might seem endless. Your hunting ranges could span hundreds of kilometers of connected river valleys and coastal flats. If times were hard in one drainage, you could move to another. If your daughter needed a mate, there were bands upriver, downriver, on the far side of the floodplain. If you were born a few tens of thousands of years later, with seas 30 or 40 meters higher, those options might be gone. The place your grandparents remembered as a broad hunting ground might now be a hazy line of islands on the horizon, reachable only if you could cross water you had never crossed before. Java is a perfect example of this trap. During low sea levels, Java sits at the southern fringe of a continuous landmass. Its rivers feed into the wider Sunda drainage. Herds can wander in, human groups can wander out. During high sea levels, Java breaks off as its own island, with only narrow, risky channels connecting it to Sumatra or Bali. You can imagine the demographic effect. In a connected Sunda, Homo erectus populations might number in the tens of thousands, spread thinly but continuously across river basins and coastal belts. In an isolated Java, the carrying capacity drops. You're limited to what the island's soils, forests and nearshore waters can support. Your total population crashes down to maybe a few thousand at best. And it wasn't just the shorelines that were moving. The habitats themselves were changing like a slow strobe light. When the climate cooled and dried, much of Sunda shifted toward more open environments. Forests pulled back into river corridors and wetter pockets. In between, you got a quilt of woodland savannas and grasslands, ideal for large grazers and the predators, including humans, who tracked them. When things warmed and moisture returned, tropical rainforests pushed out again. Dense, towering canopies, thick understory, a very different kind of food web. Fewer open country grazers, more arboreal primates, fruit eaters, and animals adapted to life in the shadows. There were times when Southeast Asia was dominated by open woodland and grassland mosaics, when Homo erectus could rely on familiar strategies, intercepting herds at river crossings, foraging the forest edge, exploiting the predictable movements of hoofed animals. There were other times when huge areas became thick jungle, where visibility dropped, paths twisted, and prey animals behaved differently. Each swing forced a recalibration. If you'd grown up watching deer and bovids on open floodplains, you might suddenly find your world crowded with pigs, monkeys, and small forest ungulates that moved in more complicated ways. Plants you once depended on might vanish locally. New ones might appear, with different seasons and different tricks needed to get at their roots or nuts. And layered over this already unstable picture was another force: fire and stone. Southeast Asia during the Pleistocene was dotted with active and recently active volcanoes. Java itself is part of a volcanic arc, the product of one tectonic plate diving under another. Over hundreds of thousands of years, eruptions were a recurring fact of life. When a big volcano blew, the immediate effects were catastrophic. Ashfalls choking rivers, burying vegetation, collapsing roofs of caves and rock shelters, pyroclastic flows scouring valleys clean. If you happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, your entire band could vanish in a single day. But in the long run, those same volcanoes created some of the most fertile soils on Earth. Fresh volcanic ash weathers into nutrient-rich material. Plants colonize quickly, forests rebound, grasses grow lush, herbivores flock to the regrowing landscape. For a few decades or centuries after an eruption, the zone around a volcano can be an ecological magnet. So Homo erectus in Java and the Sunda region were living in a world where destruction and opportunity were tightly intertwined. The best hunting grounds might also be the places most at risk of being wiped out every few thousand years. Now think about what that does to a food web. Every time sea level dropped, new coastal plains opened up, creating huge shallow marine environments. Fish populations boomed, shellfish beds expanded, mangroves spread. Bands that knew how to exploit these resources could thrive, at least seasonally. Every time sea level rose, many of those flats drowned. River mouths shifted inland, estuaries reconfigured. Species that had been abundant could crash in a few centuries. Predators, and that includes humans, had to track these moving resource zones, or suffer the consequences. Add climate swings on top of that, and the tempo of change accelerates. In cooler, drier phases with lots of open habitat, large herbivores proliferate: deer, ancient cattle, wild pigs, elephant-like proboscideans. Carnivores and omnivores that specialize in big game do well. In warmer, wetter, forest-dominated phases, many of those big grazers decline or retreat, replaced by more forest-adapted species: primates, small deer, tapirs, rodents, birds. Each reshuffling of the deck changes who competes with whom. Homo erectus, as far as we can tell, were broad generalists. They could take advantage of different prey types, scavenge, gather plant foods, perhaps collect shellfish. That flexibility is probably why they lasted so long. But flexibility has limits. If your population is confined to a shrinking island, and the main herbivores your hunting methods depend on are declining because the forest has closed in, you're squeezed. If at the same time a major eruption knocks out a key river valley, or pushes ash into coastal shallows, you're squeezed again. If climate then flips and sea level rises another few meters, erasing lowland refuges you'd fallen back on during the last dry spell, you're squeezed a third time. These pressures don't have to line up perfectly to erode a population. They just have to overlap often enough that your recovery time between hits grows shorter and shorter. And there's another twist. Landscape instability doesn't just shape what you eat, it shapes who else is there to eat it. As the Pleistocene wore on, other human lineages, more derived forms of Homo in mainland Asia, and eventually fully modern Homo sapiens, began to move through the same region. They were following their own resource maps, tracking the same shifting rivers and coastlines, drawn to the same fertile volcanic soils and rich estuaries. When land bridges were open, those newcomers could, in theory, walk right into Sunda. When seas rose, their advance might stall at the water's edge, or not, depending on their technology. For a time, Homo erectus might have been buffered by geography. A flooded strait here, a band of dense rainforest there, enough to slow or divert competing populations. But as climates flipped back and forth and coastlines marched in and out, those barriers would have appeared and disappeared like doors in a maze. Sometimes the doors stayed shut, sometimes they swung wide open. In that sense, the fate of Homo erectus in Southeast Asia may not have been decided solely by their brains, their tools, or their social structures. It may have hinged on where exactly their bands were standing when the next sea level pulse arrived, when the next volcanic sequence unfolded, when the next window for migration briefly opened across the Sunda Shelf. Were they on a land bridge that was about to drown, on a volcanic flank that was about to blow, on an island that was about to find itself suddenly within reach of a different kind of human? When you look at the late Pleistocene map of this region and watch the shorelines flicker, the forests advance and retreat, the volcanoes flare and cool, a different kind of explanation for disappearance comes into view. Maybe Homo erectus wasn't simply outcompeted in some straightforward, head-to-head contest of minds and muscles. Maybe they were caught at the intersection of bad timing and bad geography, in a part of the world where the ground under your feet, the water at your doorstep, and the animals you depended on could all change faster than a small, isolated population could adapt. And into that unstable stage, right when those doors and bridges were shifting most dramatically, new actors stepped out of the wings. When those doors opened, they didn't stay empty for long. By the time the Sunderworld was breathing in and out for the last few glacial cycles, Southeast Asia wasn't just a backdrop for one kind of human anymore. It was a crossroads. On the mainland, the north and west, there were other descendants of those same ancient survivors. More derived forms of Homo, what paleoanthropologists loosely bundle under names like Homo heidelbergensis, archaic Homo sapiens, maybe even early Denisovan-like populations, were already experimenting with different bodies, different faces, different ways of life. Farther north, Neanderthal-like groups were carving out a niche in colder, more seasonal environments. To the northeast, in what we now call China, There were enigmatic skulls and jaws that don't fit neatly into any species box. Dali, Jiniushan, Sujiayao. And somewhere out east, tucked into caves in the Altai and roaming across Asia, the Denisovans themselves. The exact family tree is messy, bones are scarce, DNA is even scarcer. Every new fossil seems to redraw the branches instead of clarifying them. But one thing is clear. By the time things were getting tricky for Homo erectus on Java, they were no longer the only humans within walking distance when sea level dropped. And then, quite late in the story, another figure appears on the edge of the stage. Our own species. Homo sapiens doesn't come roaring out of Africa in a single wave. The evidence suggests a series of pulses and probes, early excursions into the Levant around 180,000 years ago. Back and forth movements as climates shifted. Multiple African populations mixing and remixing before anything like us stabilizes genetically. But somewhere between about 70,000 and 60,000 years ago, one of those pulses doesn't turn back. A group, maybe a few hundred, maybe a few thousand, crosses the narrow corridor out of northeast Africa and keeps going. Within a geologic eye blink, their descendants are in India, then Southeast Asia, then Australia. Exactly how fast and by what routes is hotly debated. Some models have them racing along a southern coastal highway, hugging shorelines, harvesting shellfish, exploiting estuaries. Others see a more patchy, stop-and-start expansion, with inland jumps and pauses that lasted thousands of years. But on any of those maps, one thing is hard to avoid. At some point, populations of Homo sapiens came within range of the Sunda Shelf. And when sea level was low, within range didn't mean gazing across a daunting ocean at a mysterious island. It meant putting one foot in front of the other across broad river plains that to them probably felt like home. What happened when they arrived is one of the great unresolved questions in human evolution. If you look at timelines drawn in textbooks, it's tempting to connect dots in the simplest possible way. Homo erectus persists on Java until, say, 100,000, or maybe as late as 50,000 years ago, depending on which dating you trust. Modern humans move into Southeast Asia around that same general window. Not long after, erectus vanishes from the fossil record. One species out, one species in. Case closed, right? The reality is almost certainly more complicated. First, the overlaps themselves are fuzzy. Dating tropical cave deposits and heavily altered sediments is notoriously difficult. Some analyses push the last Java Homo erectus fossils back toward 100,000 years ago. Others argue they might be younger. New human remains in the region, like those tiny strange Homo floresiensis on Flores and the more recently described Homo luzonensis in the Philippines, show that Southeast Asia was home to multiple small, isolated human populations well into the time frame of Homo sapiens expansion. So rather than a clean baton pass from one species to another, picture a patchwork. Islands where one lineage hung on longer than we'd expect. Peninsulas where archaic and modern groups might have overlapped for centuries, or never met at all. Inland refuges buffered by rainforest or highlands, coastal corridors where newcomers flowed through quickly, scarcely leaving a footprint. In that patchwork, what kind of pressure could Homo sapiens really exert on Homo erectus? It doesn't have to be heroic battles or cinematic confrontations. If you come from a lineage that's been evolving in Africa's ecological roller coaster, dealing with rapid climate swings, experimenting with broader diets, tinkering with tools at a faster pace, you might arrive with quiet but powerful advantages. You and your kin can eat almost anything. Big game when it's available, small game when it's not. Fish, shellfish, insects, nuts, seeds, underground storage organs. You're comfortable experimenting with new food sources and new ways of processing them. You can heat, soak, pound, ferment. A plant that was marginal for Homo erectus becomes a staple for you because you have a few extra steps in your culinary vocabulary. Your tools change quickly. Instead of a relatively conservative toolkit that stays stable for hundreds of thousands of years, your stone and bone technologies are in constant flux. Points get lighter, sharper, more specialized. You learn to combine materials, stone, bone, wood, plant fibers, resins, into composite tools. You don't just react to environmental change, you preempt it by innovating before you absolutely have to. And then there are your social networks. Genetic and archaeological evidence suggests that Homo sapiens, even in small bands, were plugged into much larger social worlds. People, objects, and ideas could travel hundreds of kilometers through chains of kinship, trade, and ritual. That scale matters. If a drought hits your valley, you don't just die or move randomly. You have news from cousins 3 valleys over. You've seen obsidian from a distant mountain, shells from a coast you've never visited. Your group has stories, songs, maybe even formal agreements that encode where you can go in a crisis and who you can ask for help. Against that kind of distributed resilience, a small, isolated island population of Homo erectus begins to look fragile, even if they're every bit as tough and clever on a day-to-day survival level. But pressure doesn't have to mean direct confrontation. Imagine a group of modern humans arriving in a region where Homo erectus already has preferred hunting grounds along river corridors. The newcomers try those spots, find them occupied, and shift slightly upslope. They start exploiting a wider range of plants, catching smaller, more agile forest game, collecting shellfish at different tidal zones. They don't attack the resident bands. They just start using the landscape differently. Over time, their broader diet and flexibility allow their numbers to grow faster. Their camps are slightly larger, their networks slightly wider. When a cold, dry phase hits and big herbivores decline, they're cushioned by their ability to pivot quickly to alternative foods. For Homo erectus, that shift might be invisible at first. They still see deer at the river. They still have access to key groves and foraging zones. But as modern human numbers climb, subtle things change. The secondary resources, the berries you rely on in lean seasons, the shellfish beds you hit when a hunt fails, the small patches of open ground where tubers are easiest to dig, are now being harvested by someone else first. Those indirect impacts add up. Niche displacement doesn't have to be dramatic. If another species systematically preempts your fallback foods, your ability to ride out bad years erodes. Your population peaks are lower, your troughs are deeper. You become more vulnerable to every other insult the environment throws at you. A volcanic ashfall, a disease outbreak, a few years of failed rains. Landscape use changes too. Modern humans might burn patches of forest deliberately to herd game, or encourage the growth of certain plants. They might build more permanent or semi-permanent camps in places Homo erectus used only seasonally. They might travel in larger, more coordinated groups, covering more ground, moving animals in new patterns. From Homo erectus' perspective, the rules of the game start to shift under their feet, not because the animals have changed, but because another kind of human is rearranging the board. And yet, the story doesn't have to be one-sided. Every time different human species have met, the genetic record tells us something surprising. They've mixed. Modern non-African humans carry Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA. Some island populations in Southeast Asia show hints of even deeper, more archaic contributions. If Homo erectus overlapped with any of these newcomers in time and space, it's hard to rule out at least some cultural exchange, even if we never get a clean DNA signature of it. Maybe bands watched each other from a distance, the way predators watch predators. Maybe there were cautious encounters at waterholes, mutual trailing of hunting parties, stolen kills. Maybe over generations that turned into low-level information flow, learning a new way to crack shells, a better way to nap a flake, a different hunting pattern for a tricky local species. We don't have hearths where Homo erectus and Homo sapiens sat side by side, separated by neat stratigraphic lines and clearly labelled stone tools. The artifacts blur together. The layers are disturbed. Tropical climates are ruthless to both bone and context, so we're left with a spectrum of possibilities. At one end, outright replacement. Modern humans arrive. Their demographic and technological edges allow them to expand, and Homo erectus slowly dwindles wherever their ranges overlap, eventually vanishing without a trace. At the other end, mosaics of coexistence, with some areas where Homo erectus holds on in marginal niches, other areas where they never encounter newcomers at all, and still others where low-level interaction, conflict, avoidance, copying, plays out for centuries before the older lineage finally disappears. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, and it's almost certainly not the same everywhere across the vast, flickering Sunda world. What we can say is this. Newcomers were almost certainly part of the story. They arrived carrying a package of advantages: dietary flexibility, faster innovation, larger social networks that would have reshaped the competitive landscape wherever they established themselves. They altered how resources were used, how fire was applied, how animals moved, how ideas travelled, but they stepped into a world that was already unstable. Rising and falling seas, shifting forests, volcanic cycles, disease dynamics, all of those forces were already squeezing Homo erectus long before anyone like us showed up. So when we ask, did new humans wipe them out, we're probably asking the wrong kind of question. It might be more accurate to say that Homo erectus was already walking a tightrope, and the arrival of modern humans and other advanced hominins shook the rope harder. In some places that was enough to knock them off. In others, they may have held on for longer than we currently know. And there's one more twist. Even if Homo erectus bodies disappeared, some of their solutions might not have. A clever way of tracking animals in mangrove swamps, a seasonal migration route across a then dry channel, a trick for dealing with a toxic plant. Those things don't fossilize, but they can be absorbed, repurposed, carried forward by whichever humans are left standing. In that sense, the new humans who arrived in Southeast Asia might not have simply erased Homo erectus. They may have inherited part of their ecological playbook, even as they unknowingly helped close the final chapter of their story. But inheritance or not, there comes a point in the record where the trail of Homo erectus goes cold. No more jaws in Java's river deposits, no more brow ridges turning up in the caves. The ground is still there, the volcanoes are still there, the tides are still washing over the drowned edges of Sunda. The humans walking those shores are different. And to understand why that change was permanent, why one of the most successful human species in history finally vanished, we have to look beyond new arrivals and ask whether something even more catastrophic was going on in the background. When scientists see a sudden break in the fossil record, the human brain wants a clean answer. Something must have happened. One day there are jaws, skull fragments, tools. A formation that's been coughing up Homo erectus bones for hundreds of thousands of years keeps doing what it's always done. Then, above a certain layer, nothing. Same general region, same volcanoes, same rivers, different humans. That sharp cut-off invites a particular kind of story, a catastrophe. Volcanoes are the usual suspects, and in Indonesia they're not exactly hard to find. Java doesn't sit politely beside a tectonic plate boundary. It's riding the impact zone. To the south, the Australian plate is being shoved under the Sunda Shelf. That grinding, sliding, melting machine has built a chain of volcanoes that are among the most dangerous on Earth. Merapi, Kalud, Semeru, and just to the west, Krakatau. Names that have turned entire skies black in recorded history. Scale that back into deep time, and you don't have to stretch your imagination very far to picture eruptions that make the modern events we've witnessed look tame. When ash falls on a landscape, it writes its own kind of timestamp. Fine volcanic glass settles out of the sky, layers up in lakes and wetlands and floodplains. If we're lucky, those ashes preserve microscopic crystals that can be dated. If we're really lucky, they contain a chemical fingerprint that ties them back to a particular eruption. Stack enough of those layers, and you get a sequence. This eruption, then this one, then the river shifted here, then these animals vanished from this valley. In the best-case scenario, you can run a thin line from a volcanic event straight to a change in the local ecosystem. In Java and the surrounding region, there are ash layers, lots of them. They show that while Homo erectus was eking out a living on the margins of rivers and forests, the ground itself was periodically detonating under their feet. Local eruptions would have choked valleys with ash, dammed rivers, poisoned lakes with acid and heavy metals. Bigger events would have sent ash clouds high enough to blot out the sun for weeks or months, changing rainfall patterns, cooling temperatures. So one very tempting picture is this. A huge eruption somewhere in the Sunda Arc late in the Pleistocene, ash blankets Java, forests die, big herbivores crash, and the already stressed population of Homo erectus finally takes a hit it can't absorb. It's clean, it's cinematic, it's intuitive, it's also hard to prove. We know, for example, that around 74,000 years ago a truly massive eruption blew the top off a volcano called Toba in what's now Sumatra. It left a caldera 100 kilometers long. Its ash shows up from the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea. For a while, some researchers argued that Toba nearly wiped out humans everywhere, that it triggered a global volcanic winter that plunged our species into a tight genetic bottleneck. That idea is much more controversial now. The genetic data don't line up well. Archaeological sites in Africa and India show continued human occupation across the supposed disaster window. Life didn't stop. It adapted. Toba is a useful cautionary tale. If an eruption that big leaves such a messy, debated signal in our own recent story, imagine trying to match anonymous ash layers to the final days of Homo erectus on one island. The dating is the sticking point. Fossils of Homo erectus from Java cluster below certain sediments. Volcanic ashes sit above, below, and between those layers. Each one can have its own age estimate with its own error bars. Thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of years wide. Different labs, different methods, different interpretations can nudge those ages forward or backward. Now try to answer a yes or no question with that data. Did this particular eruption cause this particular extinction? The uncomfortable answer is usually, we don't know. What we can say, with much more confidence, is how disasters like that kill. Volcanism doesn't just flatten everything in a single blast and then walk away. It kills in rings. Close to the crater, it's immediate. Pyroclastic flows, the dense glowing avalanches of superheated gas and ash, move faster than a sprinting human. Anything caught in their path is simply erased. Farther out, the problem is ash depth. A few centimetres might be survivable. A few tens of centimetres will smother young plants, clog streams, collapse flimsy shelters. Herbivores that rely on grazing lose their food base. Browsers that can strip leaves from surviving shrubs may hold on a bit longer, but their carrying capacity plummets. Then there's the water. Ash falling into lakes and rivers doesn't just sit there. It changes pH, introduces soluble metals, encourages algal blooms. Fish die en masse. Amphibians vanish. Animals that depend on those water sources for drinking suddenly face a choice between dehydration and poisoning. Carnivores, including humans, are caught on the downstream end of that cascade. At first, a disaster might look like an opportunity. Dead and dying animals everywhere, easy protein. But once that glut passes, the real consequences appear. Pregnant females miscarry. Young don't make it through their first dry season. Migratory herds divert around devastated zones for years, sometimes generations, and volcanic ash doesn't care about species boundaries. A band of Homo erectus and a band of Homo sapiens moving through the same landscape are both breathing the same dust, drinking from the same fouled streams, watching the same tree line die back. If one of those groups has a broader diet, more flexible settlement patterns, or a wider network of allies to call on, they might weather the aftershocks better. But both are still being hit by the same hammer. Eruptions are just the loud catastrophes. There are quieter ones. Disease, for example, can function as a catastrophe without ever leaving a neat black line in the sediments. Pathogens evolve. Animal reservoirs expand and contract with climate. A virus or bacterium that was once constrained to a particular bat species or rodent population might, under the right conditions, make the jump into humans, any humans around. On an island like Java, where human groups are small and relatively isolated, a new disease doesn't need to be as contagious as, say, modern influenza to be devastating. A pathogen that spreads slowly but kills a third of its victims could, over a few generations, gut fragile lineages, especially if it targets the very young or the reproductive age adults. We're unlikely to ever find direct evidence of such an event in the bones of Homo erectus. Soft tissues, pathogen genomes, detailed mortuary practices, all the things that could give us a smoking gun are almost always gone. There are other silent catastrophes too, ecological cascades that unfold over decades instead of days. Say a series of moderate eruptions or climate pulses knocks out a key tree species in a lowland forest. That tree produced nuts or fruits that were seasonally critical for a certain primate, or pig, or deer. Those animals decline. Predators that leaned on them, big cats, crocodiles, humans, have to scramble for alternatives. If, at the same time, sea level is rising, pushing coastlines back, flooding low-lying plains, the total area of good habitat shrinks. Mangroves invade former grasslands. Swamps expand. The nice, predictable mosaic of riverine forest and open ground that Homo erectus relied on becomes patchier, less reliable. No single day counts as the catastrophe. There's no one ash layer you can point to and say, this was the end. But from the perspective of a species with relatively low genetic diversity, conservative technology, and modest social networks, the effect can be the same as a sudden blow. Generation after generation, recruitment drops a little. Territories break. The distance between remaining bands stretches. An unlucky storm here, a localized epidemic there, A bad run of years where young don't survive, and an entire lineage can slide past the point of recovery without any big, obvious disaster to mark the moment. This is why the catastrophe hypothesis is both compelling and slippery. We see the scars of eruptions, the signs of climate swings, the hints of ecological upheavals. We know in principle that any of them, or a combination, could have pushed Homo erectus over the edge, especially in a world where new human species were already nibbling at their ecological niches. But tying a particular event to their final disappearance is like trying to match a faint echo to a specific shout in a canyon that's been ringing for 1,000,000 years. The dating isn't good enough. The fossil record is too patchy. The environment was already changing in slow, complicated ways. So we're left with a range of possibilities. Maybe there was a local eruption that hit one of the last strongholds of Homo erectus on Java at exactly the wrong moment. A time of low numbers, declining genetic health, growing competition, a single straw fat enough to break the camel's back. Maybe there wasn't a single straw at all. Maybe what we're really looking at is a long, uneven fade-out, a process where catastrophes, big eruptions, bad disease years, sudden storms, are just spikes in a background of gradual decline, where each shock trims away another cluster of bands until what's left is a handful of tiny scattered groups, clinging on in marginal refuges most modern humans wouldn't even recognize as habitable. If that's the case, then the real question isn't what was the disaster, but what does that kind of slow vanishing actually feel like from the inside? What does it mean on the scale of families and campfires for a human species to go extinct not with a bang, but with a long, barely perceptible dimming? To answer that, we have to follow Homo erectus into those final shrinking refuges and imagine what a last chapter written in whispers instead of explosions might have looked like. Imagine being born into one of those last bands. You don't know you're the last. You don't know that somewhere, in layers of mud that haven't even formed yet, your bones will be the youngest example of your entire kind. You just know the world feels emptier than the stories say it used to be. Your grandparents talk about other groups up the river, down the coast, across the low hills. They remember trading partners, marriage partners, rivals. Winter camps flickering on distant ridges. They remember trails that felt well worn. You grow up walking those same paths and finding no one. The first part of a slow extinction doesn't feel like a disaster. It feels like a thinning out. The good places get rarer. On Java and its neighbouring islands, coastlines are shifting with every ice age pulse. When glaciers lock up water at the poles, sea level drops, exposing broad coastal plains rich in game and edible plants. When ice melts, the sea pushes back, drowning those plains, turning familiar hunting grounds into mudflats and then open water. At the same time, climate swings are shuffling the deck inland. Forests pull back, then surge forward. Grasslands spread, then fracture into isolated pockets. Rivers carve new channels. A valley that once held a mosaic of habitats, a perfect mix of cover, water, and open ground, can, over a few thousand years, turn into something much less forgiving. Too wet, too dry, too steep, too monotonous. For a generalized, flexible species with high mobility and strong social ties, these changes are painful but survivable. You shift your range, you lean harder on trade, you experiment with new foods, new tools, new ways of living. For a species that has become finely tuned to a particular kind of landscape, the options narrow. Homo erectus had survived all over the Old World for a very long time, so they weren't helpless. But on late Pleistocene Java, by the time our own lineage and our cousins were moving through Eurasia, with increasingly sophisticated toolkits and social systems, Homo erectus seems to have been backed into ecological corners. Not all corners are equal. Some refuges are true sanctuaries, places where rivers, uplands and coastlines intersect to create a stable, resource-rich patch that can buffer climate swings. Others are more like life rafts made of rotten wood. They float for a while, but every new wave makes them more fragile. As habitats shrank and fragmented, Homo erectus bands were likely pushed into smaller, more isolated pockets of workable land. Maybe a particular stretch of riverine forest that still held enough game. Maybe a plateau above the worst of the flooding. Maybe a patchwork of secondary growth forest that had sprung up after an eruption, rich in pioneer plants but lacking the old, reliable resources. The first casualty of that kind of fragmentation is numbers. Small, scattered groups simply can't replace themselves as easily. Every drought hits harder. Every bad year of fruiting, every failed hunt, Every infected wound pulls a little more out of the population than it can afford to lose. This is demographic fragility. When a population is large, individual tragedies vanish into the averages. A few unlucky years get smoothed out over thousands of births and deaths. There's enough slack in the system that even big shocks, storms, fires, local eruptions, can be absorbed. When a population is down to a few hundred individuals spread across multiple islands and valleys, there is no slack. If one band of 20 disappears in a flood, or a landslide, or a disease outbreak, that's not just a sad story. That's 10% of the remaining species gone in a single bad week. If another band loses most of its reproductive adults over the next decade, the children born into that group may never find mates from outside. They grow up and pair off with their cousins because there's no one else. Over time, this erodes genetic resilience. Inbreeding doesn't always mean immediate catastrophe, but it increases the odds that harmful genetic variants will be expressed. It reduces the diversity that natural selection can work with. When a new disease shows up, or when the climate lurches yet again, a genetically diverse population might have a few lucky individuals with resistance. A genetically impoverished one might have none. You don't need a gigantic volcano to finish off a lineage in that condition. You just need the usual background noise of life on a dynamic planet. A few storms, a few dry years, a bad run of births where too many infants are stillborn or don't make it past their second rainy season. From the outside, from our vantage point, a long decline like this is almost invisible. The fossil record is naturally coarse-grained. It doesn't give us a yearly census. It gives us occasional snapshots that happen to be preserved under exactly the right conditions. Imagine taking a million-year movie and keeping one frame every 50 or 100,000 years. Now imagine that those frames are only from places where bones were buried quickly and then protected from erosion. Then imagine that most of those frames have been torn, smudged, or lost. That's the record we're trying to read. If Homo erectus persisted in small, scattered, and geographically awkward refuges in their final tens of thousands of years, the chance of those last individuals dying in exactly the right circumstances to fossilize, in exactly the right places for us to find them, is tiny. So, on paper, it looks like this. A long run of Homo erectus fossils in certain layers, then an abrupt stop. Our pattern-hungry brains see a cliff. Reality was probably more of a long, rough staircase. Step down, plateau, step down, plateau. Each step representing the loss of a region, a cluster of bands, a whole island's worth of genetic diversity. Somewhere on those lower steps, the last group slowly thinned out until there was no one left to bury, no one left to leave tools in caves or butcher marks on bones. Why couldn't they bounce back, the way our own lineage did after near disasters? Part of the answer is specialization versus flexibility. Over hundreds of thousands of years, different human species followed different evolutionary bets. Neanderthals pushed the cold specialist strategy. Thick bodies, powerful limbs, tools and habits tuned to high-latitude hunting. Denisovans, as far as we can tell, spread into extreme environments and paid for it with remarkable physiological tweaks, high-altitude adaptation, possible dietary specializations. Homo erectus, in their prime, were the original generalist explorers, but late in their history, isolated on islands like Java, they may have drifted toward narrower ecological strategies, comfortable in certain mosaics of forest and open ground, leaning heavily on particular prey species and particular gathering zones. Our own lineage, evolving back in Africa, seems to have doubled down on flexibility itself. Wider diets, faster cultural change, more complex sharing networks that could move information and resources across long distances. When the environment changes slowly and predictably, specialization can be a winning move. You squeeze every drop of efficiency out of a known niche. When the environment starts lurching, jerking from cool to warm, wet to dry, stable to chaotic within the span of a few generations, specialization turns from an asset into a liability. If you're tied to a specific kind of forest edge, and those forests retreat upslope, you have to follow. If rising seas cut your route, or if another human species is already occupying the new suitable patch with better tools and tighter alliances, you're stuck. Geography sharpens these traps. Islands like Java are both refuges and prisons. Coastlines, channels, and submerged ridges reconfigure with every sea level shift. Sometimes land bridges open, allowing movement in and out. Sometimes they close, locking populations in place just as conditions deteriorate. A Homo erectus band watching familiar mangroves drown, or a key floodplain disappear under the sea, can't simply march inland forever. At some point, they hit mountains, dense forest, or territories already held by better-armed, more numerous competitors. Competition matters here, but not as a simple, we killed them all story. New human species arriving in Southeast Asia, whether they were early Homo sapiens, Denisovans, or other, now mysterious lineages, didn't need to wage open war to push Homo erectus toward the exit. They just needed to be slightly better at turning the same landscape into babies, better tools that waste less meat, more flexible social rules about sharing, tighter kin networks that can send help when a local drought hits, more efficient use of marginal foods, shellfish, roots, tough seeds, that Homo erectus either couldn't process as well or didn't lean on culturally. In a world of small, fragile populations, a tiny reproductive edge compounds fast. If one species averages 2.1 surviving children per female over many generations and the other averages 1.8, the first slowly fills the map while the second fades, even if they never meet in anger. When they do meet, it might be in a tense standoff at a waterhole, or in a wary exchange of glances across a river. Maybe sometimes it's even in mixed camps, shared mates, borrowed tools. The outcome from a distance looks the same. One lineage expands, the other contracts. Layer on top of that the intermittent insults, eruptions, storms, disease pulses, and you don't get a neat single-cause extinction. You get interference patterns. A volcanic ashfall doesn't wipe out all humans in a region, but it might hammer the last, smallest Homo erectus refuges harder than the more numerous, more connected competitors. A new pathogen doesn't care what species you are, but its spread is shaped by social structure. A virus that burns through a few isolated Homo erectus bands might simply fizzle out for lack of hosts, while denser Homo sapiens populations, with more frequent long-range contact, evolve partial immunity faster. Sea level rise doesn't intend to erase anyone, but when it eats a low-lying coastal plain, the groups that already have boats, or trading partners inland, or memories of alternative hunting grounds, stand a better chance of landing on their feet. By the time the last Homo erectus child is born, somewhere in a humid valley, in a shelter that smells of smoke and wet earth, there is no single doom hanging overhead, no one volcano warming up, no one disease tearing through camp. There is only the accumulated weight of a million tiny disadvantages pressing down. From our side of the fossil layers, this produces a frustrating picture. We want to be able to say, this eruption killed them, or this competitor replaced them. The way we draw battle lines in more recent history, the evidence keeps slipping away from that simplicity. The dates blur, the bones run out before the ash layers we wish we had. Genetic traces are too faint or too scrambled to point to a coup de grace. The honest answer is that there may never have been a single wipeout moment for Homo erectus. No day the last band watched the last sunset knowing they were witnessing the end. Instead, there was likely a long dusk. Decades, centuries, perhaps a few thousand years where their numbers dwindled below the threshold of recovery, even as life looked, on the scale of days, much the same. Wake up, find food, avoid predators, nurse children, tell stories about ancestors who hunted in richer valleys and met more neighbours on the trail. Somewhere along that fading curve, the last old woman who still remembered meeting another band died. Somewhere, the last young man wandered a familiar ridge and found no fresh footprints but his own. And then, at some point, the fire in the last Homo erectus camp went out, and no one was left who knew how to light it again in that particular way. From then on, the only humans left to walk those islands were other kinds of humans, our cousins and eventually us, stepping into a world already shaped by hands that would never touch it again, understanding that ending matters not because it gives us a tidy culprit, but because it forces us to see extinction as a process, not a punchline. A process shaped by climate, geography, competition, chance, and the internal limits of a species' own biology and culture. And it leaves us with an uncomfortable reflection. If a human species that lasted more than 1 million years can vanish in a long, quiet dimming we can barely reconstruct, what does that say about our own story and the kinds of futures we're currently building? That's where their disappearance stops being just an ancient mystery and starts becoming a mirror. 2 million years is a hard number to feel. Our own written history is a few thousand years deep, Agriculture is maybe 10,000. Most of what we think of as civilization fits inside a narrow slice, at the very end of the timeline. Against that scale, Homo erectus isn't just an ancient cousin. They're a demonstration of what long-term survival actually looks like. 2 million years of getting up every morning and making it work, through dozens of ice ages and warm spells, through shifting rivers, rising and falling seas, forests advancing and retreating like slow green tides, through predators evolving alongside them, parasites tracking their bodies, diseases learning their immune systems. They kept walking. They kept figuring things out. They kept passing whatever worked from old hands to younger ones. That's not failure. That's success on a scale we can barely comprehend. Their ending forces us to reframe extinction. In everyday language, extinction sounds like a freak event, a kind of cosmic mistake that interrupts the normal flow of life. In evolutionary terms, it is the normal flow of life. Species appear, change, spread, and disappear. Every form we see around us is a momentary arrangement in a process that never stops. But it feels different when the extinct thing is almost us. We can look at trilobites or ammonites and shrug. They're symbols on a museum wall. Homo erectus is closer. They walked upright. They made tools. They raised children, nursed sick relatives, probably told stories in the firelight about things that scared them and things that made them laugh. We carry echoes of their anatomy. We inherited parts of their behavioral blueprint: curiosity, persistence, a willingness to push over the next ridge to see what's there. When a lineage like that slips away, it hits a nerve. It reminds us that being human is not a fixed essence sitting outside of time. It's a moving target, assembled through experiments that can be abandoned. We are one version of that experiment. They were another. And for all we've learned about them, the story is still full of blank spaces. The last appearance dates on Java could shift with a single new find. A mandible in a cave we haven't excavated yet. A buried shoreline site exposed by a landslide. Improved dating methods might stretch their survival closer to our own arrival in the region, or pull it farther back, emphasizing how alone they already were when we first walked those coasts. Ancient DNA, if we ever managed to recover fragments from tropical sites, could scramble our neat species boxes. Maybe Homo erectus interbred with other archaic humans much more than we think. Maybe some populations were already drifting toward something new, a late lost branch that never quite flowered. Even a single tooth with good genetic preservation could redraw the family tree we've been sketching in pencil. Better climate reconstructions might reveal that what looked like a gentle fade was punctuated by brutal pulses, or that some refugees were more stable than we've assumed, making their failure even more poignant. New isotope studies on their teeth could show seasonal movements, diets that expanded or narrowed in their final millennia, hints at cultural flexibility we haven't given them credit for. Every new method, every new site has the potential to tilt the story. The outlines will probably stay the same, a long rise, a long plateau, a long descent, but the emotional texture could change. More contact with other humans, less. More innovation, less. More chances to survive that they almost, but not quite, turned into a second act. For now, we're left with a quiet image, a campsite on a Javan hillside that's been used on and off for hundreds of generations. The same flat rocks blackened by countless fires. The same overlook where you can see the river bend and the distant glimmer of mangroves. Paths radiating out, to a favoured fig tree, to a salt lick, to a crossing where animals predictably funnel between ridges. Then, one year, no one comes back. There's no dramatic last stand. Just a fire that isn't relit. A trail that isn't recut after the monsoon. Vines thicken over the sleeping hollows. Leaf litter buries a discarded hand axe. The forest forgets the sound of their footfalls. Other humans will eventually walk that slope, but the continuity is broken. The line of memory that stretched back unbroken for almost 2 million years has a knot in it now. Everything on our side of that knot has to guess. In that silence there's a warning, and a kind of comfort. The warning is that no tenure on this planet is guaranteed, not even for a species that seemed indestructible by the standards of deep time. The comfort is that meaning doesn't depend on permanence. A life, a lineage, can matter without lasting forever. If you've stayed with this story, let it sit with you for a moment. Then, if you'd like to hear more journeys into deep time, you can help this channel keep going by tapping like, subscribing, and turning on notifications. It really does make a difference. I'd also love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment with your city, region, or just the kind of landscape outside your window. And if this left you curious about what else is buried under our feet, other vanished humans, lost climates, forgotten catastrophes, there's a whole book of prehistoric secrets waiting for you. You can read more about it and pick up a copy at sleepytimehistory.com. Somewhere on some forgotten hillside, the last Homo erectus fire went out. We can't relight it for them, but we can carry the awareness of that long, fragile story into our own brief moment and decide what we do with the time our version of humanity has been given.